on my website, jwilburn.com, I'm reading all of Stephen King's books back in order. At the time that I wrote this, I was on Everything's Eventual, which is a short story collection from the early 2000s. Stephen King Revisited was, well, this will be in the article a little bit, but was started by Richard Chismar with Cemetery Dance. I'm ahead of where he is in the reading so far, but of course he's running a whole publishing company, so I'll give him a pass on that. But I write a blog post, sort of a short one, before the books. I'm getting more into some of the books that I haven't read, so some of those are pretty short and just about my perceptions of the book before I started. Some of them are longer when I have more of a story and history with the book. But then I'll write an after post using some of the notes that I took while I was going. I didn't say a lot about every story in this post, but I'll kind of expand on it a little bit as we read through. After Everything's Eventual, hashtag Stephen King Revisited by Jay Wilburn. The plan is to reread all of Stephen King's works in the order that they were published. Richard Chismar of Cemetery Dance had the vision. I'm doing it because I am a writer and I want to improve my fiction. I love Stephen King stories. I think there is something to be learned through this process. You can also go back to the beginning and read Before Carrie or any of my other posts through this one and beyond by checking out this link to the master list of all my Stephen King Revisited posts. And we're looking at Everything's Eventual. After revisiting Everything's Eventual, this short story collection has risen in my esteem. I already liked it and ranked it high among his collections in my mind, but I think if I were putting Stephen King's collections in order of greatness now, I might have to consider ranking this one higher than I would have in the past. This is not a collection full of perfect stories. There are two that involve waking up from a dream in one form or another. A couple struggle to find an ending, but that comes with the territory when you line up Stephen King stories all in a row like this. This 2002 release had its table of contents decided by dealing out playing cards at random. In the introduction, he jokes about deciding the next collection's order via tarot cards. He also talks about a serial novel online called The Plant. Where is that? I ended up finding that on his website later, and it's incomplete. So I kind of stirred myself up by reading an incomplete work there, but that's okay. He mentions the fear of opening mail in the anthrax scare that followed September 11th terror attacks. King says what's lost tends to stay lost as he discusses playing with the idea of writing and selling/publishing in new ways. This is an interesting discussion in regard to modern evolutions in publishing. King discusses it in reference to making big money with his first experiment with ebooks. That story appears in this collection. So he talked about ebooks like it was this strange new formation of publishing, and he didn't know where it was going to go in the future. So it was kind of interesting to see how he became a part of that. And of course, when he did an ebook at the beginning of ebooks, it sold very, very well. All right. In these, I kind of have a few notes from each of the stories, and I'll talk about them a little bit more. Autopsy Room 4 was the first story in the collection. A stockbroker and golfer from Derry finds himself conscious in a place where only the dead should reside. The terror of being unheard, unnoticed, and defenseless, being an object about to be taken apart. The ending lines in this story are some of my favorites. I remember this one as soon as I opened the book. I did read this younger, so when I was a younger guy, I was still an adult, but it kind of hit me a little harder in terms of me not being as used to horror at that point. I was reading horror, of course, but I guess I wasn't as jaded. I don't know if that's the right word, but that story holds a place in my mind back when I hadn't read as much extreme horror as I have now, and so it still works for me as a story, but I do think part of that's my emotional connection to it. The Man in the Black Suit. An old man recounts a story of terror from childhood after finding himself on the other end of life in Castle Rock. I sense some of the seeds of Gwendy's button box in the framing of this story. In 1913, a man in Castle Rock chopped up his wife and kids because the ghost told him to. A bee plays a big part in this story, as it had in Black House, which was a novel he co-wrote with Peter Straub. It was it was just luck and not the intercession of the God I sang to and worshipped all these years. This is one of the two stories in the collection where the harbinger of death does not tell the whole truth. It was a pretty good story. I actually don't remember it from the first time I read it, and it caught me a little bit unnerving, and kind of reminded me of some of the villains in past stories. But it was pretty dark and pretty scary. All right, all that you love will be carried away. I'm not sure why this story stuck with me all these years since I first read it, but it has. I remember considering the idea of getting a notebook and collecting graffiti like the character in this story, and like Stephen King himself said he did in the author's notes. The idea of copying down graffiti being a problem that would derail a suicide attempt is a fascinating conflict. King mentions game cubes, the golden compass, and Harry Potter. The ambiguous ending is haunting. I do like this story. It's kind of a very sort of desolate feeling, and it was really well written. All right, The Death of Jack Hamilton. This ranks high among King's crime fiction stories. Jack has a bad time in this story. It's a cool secret history slash alternate history for an old time outlaw. Some very good and surprising heartfelt crime fiction. So in this story, he's writing about a real life criminal, but then kind of sticks in some characters that I believe are fictional, and it sort of humanizes the characters as they're making their escapes. And I don't think King gets as much credit for his crime fiction writing as he really should. People don't really think of him that way, but reading all his books in order has kind of opened me up to sort of his history of crime fiction writing. Occasionally he'll stick in the supernatural to his crime fiction, as one might expect from Stephen King, but this one's a straight crime fiction story and very, very much character driven. All right, In the Death Room. A 1 in 30 chance you can act your way out of this. A fascinating twist on an interrogation scene. The character's basically in a situation that he shouldn't be able to escape, and King kind of explores the idea of whether he actually could. Pretty well written. Again, good character work, good crime fiction work. Little Sisters of Illyria. The setting was lifted out of Black House, and I was ready to hear this story the moment I read the hints of it in that novel. This is a great gunslinger slash Dark Tower story that rivals the quality of the novels themselves. Almost a perfectly constructed story. If I could only read one story again, or had to read one story again in here, I think it might be this one, because there's a lot to this story. It is in the gunslinger sort of universe, that Dark Tower universe, and kind of picks up early on when he's still sort of on his own. I really like this story because it was kind of hinted at earlier on. Oh, good. I'm glad you like that one too. I didn't remember it from reading the thing the first time, so I may have skipped this story when I was reading it years ago. I had a bad habit of that. It's not. It is close to perfect. There are a couple details that the logic of them is a little convoluted, but that being said, almost perfect pacing, almost perfect tone, really good unnerving horror, and then of course I think it brings out the best of that particular universe. And the more I think about it, it may be my favorite story in the collection, although I do like the actual title story, Everything's Eventual, too, here. The title story I've remembered since I first read it. The knockaround character with the strange powers and strange life is well written. A suit means business, while jeans and a t-shirt mean fuckery. Like being born again, and being born always hurts, I guess. The internet room at the library costs money to use. I thought I was really living a life, but all I was doing was throwing a shadow. It's a great story. Again, rereading it, it's a lot of exposition, but again, I think it's done really, really well. I am pretty highly forgiving of Stephen King's work. I'm just so used to how he writes that I'll read things from him that I wouldn't accept from someone else. Yeah, I like this collection too, and I like it more from revisiting it. I remember I kind of had the reverse feeling when I reread Nightmares and Dreamscapes. For a long time, that was my favorite, and it had more to do with the time in my life that I read it and a couple key stories in there that I really, really enjoyed. And I still like those stories, but Nightmares and Dreamscapes, when I reread it, kind of felt like a clearinghouse of sort of everything he had laying around, and not all of it lined up as well as I remembered. But rereading Everything's Eventual, the collection and the story itself, that kind of raised that collection in my estimation of those stories. LT's Theories of Pets I liked a good bit too. This one is apparently Stephen King's favorite in the collection, and the one he picks for readings for the humor and for the turn at the end. Good emotional redirect at the end of this one. I do think it's really good, and I could see why it works as a reading. I don't think it's the strongest story in the collection, but again, it's one that I did like. All right, The Road Virus Heads North. This was inspired by a picture King actually had. He followed another author character from Derry. There apparently are a bunch of authors in Derry that keep running upon the supernatural. King's character takes a dig at fantasy and horror conventions. Ordering news with a credit card over the news wire is an arcane and short-lived practice. Opened a hole in the basement of the universe is a good turn of phrase. The ending of the story is a bit blurry and could have been stronger. Again, this story felt a little bit. It wandered a little bit, I think. I don't think any of the scenes were written badly. I don't think the characters were written badly. I don't think the horror is undermined at all. But again, as with many Stephen King things, I think the ending could have been better. And I don't think it's the strongest in the book. Lunch at the Gotham Cafe is well structured, build up and foreshadowing, great violent tale with satisfying proportions. I like the characters in that story. I like the stuff about those characters that make me not like them as people. And then of course, sort of the out of place, unexplainable burst of violence that happens through the story is very, very interesting. And then how that plays out with the characters. As I was kind of looking back through this collection, maybe this might be the story that stood out with me the absolute most. So Lunch at the Gotham Cafe, I think, is maybe one of King's underrated stories. Next was That Feeling You Can Only Say What It Is in French. It's unnerving and a hell of a story. I do think some of the looping that I'm trying not to do any spoilers. I'm sure people here have already read some of these, but for anybody that sees recordings later, I don't want to be the spoiler guy as much as I can help. I think some of the looping in that story maybe didn't work quite as well as it might have. I still enjoyed it a pretty good bit. 1408, again, a lot of people now might remember this from the movie that came out about it. But this began as a beginning story sample in On Writing. A good take on the caretaker's warning. Teeth filed to cannibal points is a new obsession for King in the last few books and stories. King kind of has a way of picking up on an idea or a turn of phrase, and then he'll use it several books in a row. I didn't notice that until I started rereading all his books in order, and so like he'll use a particular type of lock, and it'll appear in several books and then kind of drift out, or he'll have a word that he really likes, and it'll appear multiple times in several novels and will kind of work its way out. And by this point, around 2002, Teeth filed to cannibal points was kind of one of his favorite little twists on creating horror. Clippers trying to speak is a scary description. The way he describes one of the voices that comes in a particular way as sort of the voice of the threat, I think really, really worked. It may just been my imagination that made it work. But of course, I guess that's how all writing works, is with the imagination of the reader. But when I allowed myself to imagine that particular voice, I think it really upped that story. It works really well. I think people who know the movie first and read the story might have trouble recognizing it because, of course, it's something different on the page. All right, last couple of stories. Riding the Bullet. This is Stephen King's legendary first ebook. It's a hitchhiking story. It's an unexpected existential ending. We're all waiting in line. I kind of like this one, but it's by far not the strongest story in the collection. It's kind of infamous in terms of that it was the first ebook e-release that King had done back when ebooks were sort of this new experiment. So he released sort of this, I guess you'd say, a long short story in that way, and it sold really really well. But compared to the other stories, I wouldn't put it first, second, third, or even fourth in this particular collection. I do like that he sort of circumvented my expectations of the story. Maybe that weakened it a little bit, maybe it didn't, but I guess you can't complain about that. And then the last story in the collection, again, not the strongest, Lucky Quarter. Another story relying on waking up from sort of a dream vision to take us forward. It's a good example of a story weakening from that approach. Overall, this is a very strong collection and really good storytelling. My next post in this series will be before From a Buick 8, which will be linked on the master list of all my Stephen King revisited posts, and of course that's available now.